You dare argue with me in my courtroom?" Judge Ronald Blake's voice thundered through the silent chamber. His black robe flared as he leaned forward, eyes narrowed, lips curled in amusement. He was enjoying this, the power, the control. To him, this was just another day of reminding people who was in charge. The defendant, an elderly woman, stood calmly at the witness box, hands neatly folded in front of her. Wisps of white hair framed her lined face, and glasses perched at the edge of her nose. She didn't shrink under his glare. She didn't fidget. Instead, she looked at him the way a teacher looks at a particularly troublesome student. "I'm not arguing, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, smooth, unshaken. "I'm simply explaining the law as it is written." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Even the clerk looked up from her paperwork. No one spoke to Judge Blake like that. Certainly not a frail old woman in a faded blue dress. The judge's nostrils flared. His fingers tightened around the gavel. "That's enough," he snapped. "I won't have back talk in my courtroom." Miss Ellie didn't respond. She simply held his gaze, unflinching, waiting. Blake's jaw tightened. The silence was suffocating. He was used to fear, to obedience, to people backing down at the first sign of his displeasure. But this woman, she wasn't backing down. $500, he barked, slamming his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Contempt of court. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Even the stenographer hesitated, fingers hovering over the keys. Miss Ellie's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of surprise, not a trace of anger. But behind her glasses, something flashed, something sharp, something dangerous. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper, and placed it gently on the defendant's podium. "If it pleases the court," she said, her voice still calm, "I'd like to submit a reference from the State Bar Association on the matter of judicial overreach." The courtroom fell into a stunned hush. Judge Blake's smirk faltered. And in that moment, though he didn't know it yet, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. 2 weeks earlier, the sun rose quietly over the small town of Maplewood. The kind of town where neighbors still borrowed sugar, kids rode their bikes past white picket fences, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted from the little diner on Main Street. It was a place that moved at its own slow, steady rhythm, unchanged, untouched. At the very edge of town, in a modest white house with green shutters, lived Miss Ellie. Most people knew her as the sweet old lady who always had a kind word and a tin of homemade cookies. She tended her rose garden every morning, walked to the library every Wednesday, and never missed Sunday service. To the townsfolk, she was just Miss Ellie. But what they didn't know, what no one in Maplewood knew, was that Eleanor Hughes had once been one of the greatest legal minds in the country. A Harvard professor, a constitutional scholar, a mentor to judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys who now filled the highest courts in the nation. She had debated in the halls of academia, authored books that reshaped legal thought, and trained some of the very people who decided the laws that governed everyday lives. But she never spoke of it, not because it made her sad, but because it simply wasn't who she was anymore. At least, that's what she told herself. One chilly Thursday morning, Miss Ellie took her usual stroll to the corner grocery store, her steps unhurried, her purse tucked under one arm. She had just stepped out, a carton of milk and a bag of oranges in hand, when she heard raised voices in the parking lot. "Your tags are expired, son," the police officer said, his tone flat, indifferent. He pointed at the young man's battered pickup truck. "That's a $250 fine." The boy, couldn't have been older than 19, shifted on his feet, his cheeks burning. "I know, sir. I just started working again. I haven't been paid yet." "Not my problem," the officer snapped, already writing the ticket. Miss Ellie watched for a moment, then walked over, her voice smooth, steady. "Excuse me, officer." The man barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, This doesn't concern you." "Perhaps," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "But I was wondering if the young man might be eligible for a warning instead. If I recall correctly, Section 4.6 of the Officer's Handbook states that a verbal warning is at the officer's discretion when the violation is non-dangerous and the driver is cooperative." The officer stiffened. His grip on the ticket book tightened. "How do you—" Miss Ellie smiled politely. "I'd be happy to file a request for review with your supervisor. Would you mind providing your badge number?" A long, heavy silence stretched between them. The officer's jaw clenched. He looked at the boy, then back at the small woman in the oversized gray coat. Finally, he muttered, "Just get the tags updated." Then he turned and walked away. The boy stared at Miss Ellie like she had just performed some kind of magic. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice still shaky. I didn't think he'd back off." Miss Ellie patted his arm gently. "Sometimes people just need a reminder that they're not above the rules they enforce." She walked away, humming softly, the oranges in her bag shifting with each step. By that evening, the whole town had heard the story. Some people cheered, others shook their heads. A few wondered how a quiet old woman knew so much about the law, but not everyone was amused. The next morning, a letter arrived in Miss Ellie's mailbox, a formal court summons. Her alleged offense? Interfering with an officer in the performance of his duties. Miss Ellie read it once, then twice. Then, with a quiet sigh, she placed it on her kitchen table, reached for a pen, and circled the court date on her calendar. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth and roses as Miss Ellie stepped onto her porch, a steaming cup of chamomile tea in one hand. It was shaping up to be another quiet day in Maplewood, or at least, that's what she thought. She bent down to collect the mail, flipping absently through bills and grocery store flyers. And then she saw it. A plain white envelope, official-looking, her name typed neatly across the front. She opened it slowly, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. Summons to appear in Maplewood District Court. The charge? Interfering with an officer in the performance of his duties. Miss Ellie sighed through her nose, pressing the paper between her fingers for a moment before folding it neatly and setting it on the kitchen table. She wasn't angry, she wasn't surprised. She was just disappointed. Not in the law itself. No, the law was meant to protect. But in the people who twisted it, wielding it like a club instead of a shield. She had spent a lifetime teaching young minds that justice was not about power, but about balance, about integrity, about fairness. But here it was, in black and white, being used to punish a small act of kindness. She took a slow sip of her tea, then reached for her pen and circled the court date in smooth, deliberate strokes. Across town, in the cold marble halls of the courthouse, Judge Ronald Blake sat at his desk, reviewing the case file that had just landed in front of him. He barely glanced at the name before smirking and tossing it aside. Another old fool who thought they could question his authority. Judge Blake had built his career on discipline, on maintaining order. He prided himself on being the toughest judge in the county, the kind who had no patience for backtalk, no tolerance for defiance. And now, he had the perfect opportunity to remind the town who held the gavel. The date was set. The case was assigned. And Judge Blake was ready to make an example of Eleanor Hughes. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Eleanor Hughes wasn't just another frail old woman shuffling through his courtroom, and she was far more prepared than he would ever be. Because while most people, when faced with a legal battle, would scramble to find an attorney, Miss Ellie didn't. She didn't need one. For the first time in years, she sat at her old wooden desk, pulled open a drawer, and dusted off a thick leather-bound book. Inside were pages upon pages of legal codes, case studies, and precedents, many of which she had written. She spent the next few days reading, annotating, cross-referencing statutes with the kind of meticulous ease that only came from years of mastery. Her hands were slower now, her eyes a little weaker, but her mind sharper than ever. So when the day finally came and Miss Ellie stepped into that courthouse, she did so with her head held high. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't afraid. She had spent decades preparing for battles like this. The only difference? This time, she wasn't standing at the front of a lecture hall. She was standing in the fight. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly through Maplewood. Everyone wanted to see how the frail old woman who had defied a police officer would fare against the infamous Judge Ronald Blake. Miss Ellie entered quietly, her gray coat neatly buttoned, her hands folded over a small leather-bound notebook. She walked with the kind of unhurried grace that made it seem as though she had all the time in the world. Judge Blake barely looked up as she took her place. To him, this was routine. Another defendant, another ruling, another chance to remind people who held the power in this room. He cleared his throat and adjusted his robe, peering down at her with thinly veiled amusement. "Eleanor Hughes," he drawled, tapping his gavel against the bench. "Charged with interfering with an officer in the performance of his duties. Do you understand the charges against you?" Miss Ellie nodded, her expression polite. "I do, Your Honor." Blake smirked. "And do you have legal representation?" She tilted her head slightly. "That won't be necessary." A small ripple of whispers moved through the audience. The judge leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Representing yourself. Brave, but foolish." Miss Ellie only smiled. Judge Blake shuffled his papers, barely glancing at the police report before launching into his usual spiel. "The law is clear. Citizens are not to interfere with police matters. You inserted yourself into an officer's duties, questioned his authority, and obstructed a citation from being issued." He glanced up. "Do you deny this?" Miss Ellie adjusted her glasses. "I do not, Your Honor." Blake's smirk deepened. "Then you plead guilty?" "Not at all," she said smoothly. "I'm simply clarifying that the law you're citing has been misapplied." Silence. Blake's amusement flickered, replaced by mild irritation. "Misapplied?" he repeated. Miss Ellie opened her notebook, flipping through the pages with careful precision. According to the state's penal code, interference constitutes physical obstruction, refusal to comply with lawful orders, or actions that directly impede an officer's duties. She stopped on a page, ran her finger down a passage, and continued. Providing verbal clarification of existing legal statutes, particularly those outlined in the officer's own handbook, does not meet the legal standard for interference. Blake's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't done. "In addition," she said, turning another page, "under the discretionary authority granted to officers, a citation is not mandatory in cases where the violation is minor, non-dangerous, and the individual is cooperative." This was not interference. It was a reminder of proper protocol. The room was dead silent. Judge Blake's fingers curled around his gavel. "Miss Hughes," he said, his voice tightening, "you are not an attorney, and this is not a lecture hall." Miss Ellie simply closed her notebook. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "I am something far worse for a man like you." A murmur rippled through the audience. The bailiff coughed into his fist. Even the court clerk, who had spent years recording Blake's rulings, stole a glance at him. Blake's nostrils flared. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone who looked like she should be baking cookies for her grandchildren. He gripped his gavel and slammed it down. Crack. "That's enough," he barked. Miss Ellie didn't flinch. Blake's face darkened. $500 for contempt of court. Another gasp. Miss Ellie simply nodded and placed her notebook back into her purse. "As you wish, Your Honor." Blake slammed his gavel again. "Next case." The bailiff hesitated before stepping forward. The court clerk fumbled with her papers. Miss Ellie turned, walking away with the same measured grace she had walked in with. Judge Blake leaned back, satisfied that he had put her in her place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in his rush to silence her, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because Eleanor Hughes wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The morning after what should have been a routine case, Judge Ronald Blake strolled into his office, feeling victorious. He had put that old woman in her place, just like he always did with people who forgot their standing in his courtroom. But his satisfaction was short-lived. There, sitting neatly at the center of his desk, was an envelope. No return address, no markings, just his name typed across the front. Blake frowned, tearing it open. A single sheet of paper slid out, covered in crisp, sharp text. Your courtroom is in violation of due process standards. Your recent ruling against Eleanor Hughes will be appealed. You will be held accountable by the law you pretend to uphold. Blake's stomach dropped. His hands tightened around the page. Appealed? By whom? He read the letter again, slower this time, as if the words would change. His jaw clenched. This was a threat. Blake slammed the paper onto his desk, his mind racing. He had been on the bench for years, long enough to know that most defendants grumbled, paid their fines, and moved on. They didn't appeal. And they certainly didn't have the legal knowledge to use a term like due process violation with such precision. Unless... Blake's fingers twitched as he reached for his phone. His court clerk, Shelley, picked up on the first ring. Find me everything on Eleanor Hughes, he barked. Now. A pause. Then a hesitant, Sir? You heard me, he snapped. Public records, legal history, anything that explains why an old woman just sent me a legal threat. Shelley didn't argue. She knew better than to question him when he was like this. Blake tossed the letter aside, but he couldn't stop glancing at it. There was something about the phrasing, the authority behind the words. This wasn't some amateur filing a complaint. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and that thought made him uneasy. An hour later, his office door swung open. Shelley stepped in, holding a folder, a thick one. I found something, she said carefully, placing it on his desk. You're going to want to see this. Blake snatched it up and flipped through the pages. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Basic records, an address in Maplewood, some property deeds, nothing out of the ordinary. Then he saw it. Eleanor Hughes, Harvard Law School faculty, tenured professor, constitutional law. Blake's breath caught. He turned the page so fast it nearly tore. Published works, Judicial Ethics and Overreach in American Courts. Guest lectures, Stanford, Yale, Columbia. Notable students, federal judges, Supreme Court clerks. Blake's grip on the folder tightened. His throat went dry. He knew that name. He knew it. A memory surfaced. Decades ago, a lecture hall at Harvard. A woman standing at the front of the class, dismantling his argument piece by piece in front of an audience of eager law students. His law professor. His heart pounded against his ribs. Eleanor Hughes wasn't just some frail old woman. She was a legal titan, a legend, someone he had once feared. And now? Now, she was standing on the other side of his courtroom. Blake sat frozen, the broken coffee cup at his feet, spilling dark liquid across the polished floor. For the first time in his career, he was the one on trial. Miss Ellie sat at her kitchen table, the morning light spilling across stacks of legal documents. The letter she had sent to Judge Blake had done its job. She knew exactly what was happening in his office right now. Panic. But she wasn't finished. Not even close. She smoothed out a fresh sheet of paper and picked up her pen. This time she wasn't filing anything for herself. This time she was fighting for someone else. James Miller. The young man from the grocery store, the one who had almost been fined for expired tags, had called her that morning, voice shaky. The police had shown up at his house. They said I never paid the fine. James had stammered. "But the officer let me off with a warning. Now they're saying I lied on the paperwork, that I—" He swallowed hard. "That I could face jail time." Miss Ellie had listened quietly, her fingers tightening around the phone. She had expected retaliation, but going after James? That was low, but also predictable. She flipped open the legal code book on her table, finding the exact statute she needed. A slow, knowing smile crossed her lips as she began writing. By noon, she was back at the courthouse, not as a defendant, but as an advocate. She approached the clerk's desk, the same clerk who had watched Judge Blake fine her just days ago. "I'd like to file a formal request to act as James Miller's legal advisor," she said, sliding the papers forward. The clerk hesitated. "You're not an attorney, ma'am." Miss Ellie smiled politely. "No, I'm not. But under Rule 83.6 of the State Civil Code, a defendant may appoint a non-attorney legal consultant if they can demonstrate specialized knowledge of the law. Would you like me to cite the precedent for you?" The clerk blinked. Her hands, now moving on instinct, took the paperwork and stamped it. I'll process this now." Miss Ellie nodded. "Much appreciated." By the time Judge Blake saw her name appear on the docket, he nearly choked on his coffee. The courtroom was packed again, but this time Miss Ellie wasn't standing at the defendant's podium. She was at the defense table beside James. Judge Blake glared down at her, gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is highly irregular," he said, barely keeping his voice steady. "Not at all, Your Honor," Miss Ellie replied smoothly. "I've followed the legal process precisely. I trust you wouldn't want to deny Mr. Miller his right to a fair defense." Blake's nostrils flared. "Proceed." Miss Ellie stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about a fine. It's about a pattern of rulings, your rulings, that have systematically penalized individuals based on personal bias rather than legal grounds." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Blake stiffened. Miss Ellie pulled out a neatly bound stack of papers and held them up. "I took the liberty of reviewing recent cases in your courtroom. In the last 18 months alone, you have disproportionately issued excessive fines and harsh sentences against lower-income defendants, most of whom had no legal representation." Blake's jaw twitched. "That is hearsay." "It's public record," Miss Ellie countered. She turned to the court clerk. "Would you mind pulling up case number 24-109 on the court database?" The clerk hesitated, glancing at Blake, but then her fingers moved across the keyboard. A moment later, the case file appeared on the screen. A single mother who had been fined $1,000 for missing a court date because she had been in the hospital with her sick child. The room fell silent. Miss Ellie turned back to Blake. "That's just one case. I have 15 more, all with the same disturbing pattern." Blake's face darkened. He slammed his gavel. "That's enough." But the damage was done. The courtroom wasn't looking at her anymore. They were looking at him. Miss Ellie met his eyes, her voice gentle but sharp. "This is no longer about me, Your Honor." She folded her hands neatly in front of her. "This is about the law. And the question now is, will it protect those who need it, or only those who abuse it?" Judge Blake didn't respond, because for the first time in his career, he was outmatched. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the weight of Miss Ellie's words still hanging in the air. Judge Blake sat motionless, gripping the arms of his chair, his face unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Then, just as he opened his mouth to regain control, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a gray suit stepped inside, his expression cool, authoritative. He moved with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he made his way to the front of the room. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Even the bailiff looked uncertain. Judge Blake's eyes narrowed. "This is a closed hearing. Who are you and why are you interrupting my court?" The man didn't so much as blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek leather wallet, and flipped it open, revealing a badge. Paul Hardgrove, State Judicial Review Committee. His voice was smooth, deliberate. "We need to talk, Judge." The room fell into stunned silence. Blake's jaw tightened. Judicial review? He forced a laugh, but there was no humor behind it. "You have no authority here. This is a municipal case." Hardgrove nodded. "Ordinarily, you'd be right. But when multiple complaints against a judge escalate to the state level, we do get involved." He turned slightly, glancing toward the clerk. "Clerk Hammond, you should have received a formal notice this morning." The clerk swallowed hard, then slowly reached into a stack of documents, pulling out a sealed envelope. She tore it open, scanning the contents. Then, with shaking hands, she looked up. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "this is an official inquiry. You are under investigation for judicial misconduct." Blake shot up from his chair. "This is outrageous." His voice cracked with anger, his face burning red. "You can't walk into my courtroom and—" "This isn't your courtroom anymore," Hardgrove interrupted. He held up a second document. "Effective immediately. You are being placed on administrative suspension. You will step down from the bench pending review." A gasp swept through the room. Blake's chest heaved. He turned to the bailiff. "Remove this man. Now." But the bailiff didn't move. Nobody did. Slowly, Blake turned back toward the crowd, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. His authority, the thing he had wielded so mercilessly for years, was slipping through his fingers like sand. And then, as if the final nail hadn't already been hammered in, a voice, calm, steady, unwavering, broke the silence. Miss Ellie stepped forward. "The law," she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, "is not a shield for the powerful. It is a voice for the silenced. And when that voice is ignored, justice ceases to exist." Her eyes met Blake's, and for the first time, he didn't see an old woman. He saw the professor he had once feared, the woman who had outmatched him twice. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of her words settling like a final verdict. And as Judge Blake stood there, stunned, with all eyes on him, he realized the truth. He hadn't just lost control, he had lost everything. Maplewood had never seen a scandal like this. By noon, Judge Ronald Blake's name was splashed across newspapers, television screens, and the town's buzzing social media pages. Suspended, under investigation, disgraced. Some people shook their heads, muttering about justice finally catching up. Others whispered that it was long overdue. But most couldn't stop talking about the woman who had brought him down, Miss Ellie Hughes. For years, she had walked among them as just another old woman tending her roses and handing out cookies. Now, people saw her for who she truly was, a force of nature, a legal mind sharper than any gavel, a woman who had never forgotten what the law was meant to be. At the local cafe, someone paid for her coffee. At the library, the staff had set aside her favorite reading chair with a fresh stack of law journals. Even the teenagers at the park, who usually ignored anyone over the age of 30, gave her quiet nods of respect. But the biggest surprise came from James. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, he approached, clutching a thick textbook under his arm. "Miss Ellie," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, I wanted to show you something." He handed her the book. She glanced down, adjusting her glasses to read the title. Introduction to Constitutional Law. Her lips curled in a knowing smile. "Law school?" James nodded, shifting on his feet. "I wasn't sure at first, but after everything, after watching you—" He exhaled. "I want to fight for people, too." Miss Ellie patted the empty seat beside her. "Then sit down, James," she said, opening the book. "We have a lot of work to do." And so, life in Maplewood settled again. Miss Ellie still walked to the library on Wednesdays. She still tended her roses and hummed old tunes while sipping her tea. But something had changed, something deep, something unshakable, because justice never retires, and neither would she. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of truth, courage, and justice, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this. Join our community, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep these powerful stories alive. Because sometimes, the right story at the right time can change everything. Subscribe now, and let's stand for justice together.